Buenos T, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we tell stories from Irish mythology and folklore and chat about them afterwards. This series is the Táin Mosaic, where we are retelling the Táin from different perspectives, coalescing the story in a way that we've never told it before. We are joining this story at its emotional, climactic peak, where a very important combat takes place at the ford. And if you are lost, we'd suggest going back to the beginning of this series and picking up with Fergus McRoy in episode 230. This podcast is brought to you by our supporters at Patreon. You can join them over at patreon.com/Candlelit Tales, or you can make a one-time donation using the PayPal button on our website. Like, share, comment, and above all, enjoy. And for now, sit back and we'll tell you a story.
Finnibhear of the Fair Eyebrows, daughter of Queen Medbh, awoke early, her eyes fluttering awake from near sleep. She felt as if she hadn't really slept deeply, her dreams disturbing, beating of black wings, hollows in the ground, blood and death, the image of Owen the Gath, parts of her filled with terror and death. Gruesome images of severed limbs and fallen heads flashed across her mind till she opened her eyes wide to the darkness surrounding her. Blinking, she saw his face, pale, beautiful, eyes wide, staring dead inside. Freke, the drop of blood from his mouth as she had fallen by the river, and she fell to her knees. Her eyes were open, but there was no light. He had barely got to the river's edge before the stone went through his head. As he fell, the hills had opened wide. Scores and scores of the Fae, all with their beautiful garments and multicoloured robes, filled the shore of the river, the women more beautiful than she had ever seen. The fairy host had gathered him in their cloaks, his soft hands and beautiful skin. The red blood had dropped from his mouth into the river. She hadn't cried. She still hadn't cried as she watched the fairy host bring Freke beneath the veil. She felt like her eyes were too tired, too cold, too dry to cry. Everything around her was dark. The wind came through the blankets. She pulled them close to her, her chest barely rising, barely falling. She noticed the small crest of space between her chest and the blanket when she exhaled. Don't trust her. She had warned him. Don't trust my mother. She will trap you. She will use your love for me to do whatever she wants. More pointless warning words that she had uttered unhindered, tumbling around in her head. She had warned him, but no matter what he did, no matter how many hoops her mother or her father had held, Freke had jumped nimbly through, and she had encouraged him. But he was dead like the rest. An end to their happy ever after, the story they had made up dashed out in the blinking glimpse of Freke's last unblinking gaze. He had fallen like the rest, even though she had given him a ring. All the rest of the heroes that this great army could produce had fallen just like him, all fallen short of the Hound of Cuchulainn. No one in this huge army could beat him, and everyone was afraid to even face him, even Fergus. When he ran from Fergus, that was strange. Finnibhear had made it a morning routine to go down to the river and watch the fights at the ford. She had seen how Fergus had gone to Cuchulainn. They'd talked, and she had seen Cuchulainn run. She noticed the resistance in Cuchulainn's body, the angry words they'd spat at Fergus, but he had turned and run away from Fergus MacRoy. Fergus, the leader of the exiles of Ulster, the now leader of the army marching against his old kingdom. Finnibhear's head began to spin. Fergus. He'd become one of her mother's consorts. Her new fascination had driven her father Aillil to his edge. Yet Medbh still spent all her time with Fergus of the long sword, Fergus of the horses. She rolled her eyes to the sky, still dark, but brightening in the east. She wrapped herself in furs, wrapping the blankets, the cold air stinging when skin met it. A hurt inside more than numb, now a feeling of coldness. Had she slept? She felt weak. She'd been thinking this whole time, this nightmarish vision of battles, constancy of it all. She had watched all of these fights at the ford, something to do in the morning at least. Standing above the hillside looking down at the river. The crossing was made easier by the widening of the shores, the many stones and rocks that slowed the water to the point of the ford where you could walk across it or wade into the depths where it got deeper in parts. Finnibhear cleared her mind and, wrapping the furs around her body, gradually warming herself as she began to move. She knew she needed to move her feet fast on the crunching cold ground below. She would go to the ford today bright and early because of last night. The memory made her nauseous. She had lured another to her mother's chambers. And Finnibhear didn't seem to care anymore either. When her dear friend, her fallen Frigg, had left her, all the love she seemed to have for him seemed to drip into the ground, now soaked, steeped full of his blood. It swept down to the grounds around her and the river running red. Had she ever really been in love with him? Did she know what love really was? I had given him the ring, though, she thought. It was supposed to be him. She blinked and saw his face again and shook herself out of the reprieve, staring at the sky now brightening above. She smiled, a smile that seemed more of a grimace to the coming day. But she smiled sweetly, because she was to be sweet, if Ferdia won. She walked towards the ford. She contemplated what life might be like with a different man. She blinked and saw Frigg again, and put out the thought of her mind. The twilight light, dark, navy, to one side, far darker in the west, far lighter and brighter, beginning to show the rays of the rising sun in the east. Two worlds colliding overhead, and down below all of the sleeping bodies of the men still in their slumber, some around fires and the dwindling embers, some wrapped in cloaks, some intense, staring into the flames flickering. Many didn't sleep, she thought. She wondered if they had nightmares of beating wings and crows cawing. They would come to the ford to watch the fight today. Most of them. The agreement was, when the fighting lasted, the army could march. But the armies didn't really get to march very far because Cuchulainn kept killing everyone very fast. Her mother wasn't very happy with that. She reached the top of the hill to look down on the river, and she saw the sunlight strike the river, just illuminate it, and there Cuchulainn's figure hunkered low, his back to the army. He sat this way across the river as he did every morning of the single combats, on the east and north side, the Ulster side. And every morning she would see him playing fichel with his charioteer, until he would turn to face his opponent. A game, she thought. Was it all a game to him? He was a savage, after all. She'd seen his handiwork. She knew it by now. Detached limbs and severed heads, frakes, white skin, unblinking eyes. She pulled her mind back to the day, the river flowing down below. And then she saw the figure, tall and dark, moving from west to east, to the ford, with low, slumping, slow and steady strides. Ferdia MacDamon, Ferdia Contanglass, skin like bone, hard, so firm no point of blade could pierce his skin, they say. The blood of the Fae run through his veins as well. Hard, hard of mind, all these men so firm and strong and hard, she thought. They all died easily enough, though. So many of these harsh, brave, hard young men gone up against Cuchulainn, who felled them like falling trees. Blood given to the water, their bodies to the bank's soil. Ferdia seemed soft last night. Finnibhear's mind flicked back, past through the beating of black wings and delirious dreams she had suffered through in the long night, to the moments before, in her mother's tent, the table of the trap. She had sat and smiled sweetly, though her heart was beating numbness throughout her body. The smile sketched across her face felt like a shield. Despite her broken parts, she poured sweet words that came flowing out of her because her mother had told her to be sweet and kind and nice, especially sweet tonight. Now that Freke is out of the picture, we'd better find you someone you'd find agreeable, my dear. Maeve had spoken curtly to her. So she was charming. She wore her slim dress cut below, so lots of skin was on show. She always did what her mother had asked her to do, no matter what it was. There was no point doing otherwise. Even if she didn't do it, her mother would find a way to make it happen. Finnibhear wasn't smart like her mother. She wasn't a general or a fighter. She wasn't as harsh or as hard as Maeve. She didn't know how to be that stern. But she was sweet, and she could keep it hidden, and she hid it very well. So she'd be sweet and nice. And she was. Ferdia was nearly at the forge, she noticed. Cuchulainn had not turned yet to see him. Were all the words men spoke lies? He had sworn he'd never fight him. Closer than brothers we are. There's no way I'll fight him. You go now and find any other man. Not me, I won't be doing it. Here he was, she thought. All he needed was some convincing. Maeve had lured him, asked him for dinner. Well, she had. Finnibhear had. The way Ferdia looked at her enveloped her. She knew the look, that loss and longing, loss of senses, craving for some softness. She had soft curves, hips, breasts. She had these hard, harsh men looking at her for that soft, supple, easy loving. Just something she had. He looked at her as if she was a glass of wine to drink, to devour and taste and flavour. She saw the look. She almost saw him salivate. And so she had smiled at him, nicely and sweetly, blushed slightly. She always seemed to blush. Not out of embarrassment, just because it was so much to take on that look and not feed it back. But not to be rude or too giving to their looks. Still somewhat charming. It was a tight line. That's what she did all night. She'd spoken softly and charming, whispered sweet things into his ear until he was feeling great about himself, and big and strong as he was, he fell hook, line and sinker for Maeve's jibes. "Oh, so it's true what Cuchulainn has said about you, Finnibhear. You're afraid to fight him." He had leapt up at that, jumped just like a dog for a ball, she thought. She had smiled sweetly, but she was shocked to see him get so angry, irritated. "Afraid of him? Not afraid of him. I'll show the little pup." Sure enough, he had given his word he'd fight Cuchulainn in the morning. Full of sweet drinks and food, sweet words, cajoling ways. Her mother had played him right. She was an instrument too, but all she did was smile sweetly. She sat down. She watched Finnibhear walk into the ford. No look of being drunk as he was last night. No sloppiness in his body language. Not as weak as he had looked last night, she thought. Now firm and strong, looking like he belonged there. The sky overhead was beginning to brighten fully as far as the west. The dark clouds were gathering, and she thought by midday they'd be overcast fully. No light penetrating, dark gloomy day ahead. She saw Cuchulainn turn and gasp, walk forward, and they exchanged words. She could see he wasn't happy to see Finnibhear. Finnibhear was convincing him to fight. Neither one wanted to, she could see that. But finally they agreed it. They went back to either side of the river. Finnibhear's head tilted to one side as she saw Laig, Cuchulainn's charioteer, that was his name, Laig. Yoke, most mesmerising horses she'd ever seen. One white, beautiful. The other black and sleek, strong. Pair of horses, contrasted to each other, yoked on Cuchulainn's chariot. And she saw both the warriors picked up light spears. Bundled under their arm, they placed them on the chariot. And then their chariot drivers whipped their horses into movement. Up and down the river they drove. She walked back down. As she came across the hill, she saw the fire of Finnibhear. And she saw that Finnibhear was gathering food, drink, other provisions that he was wrapping in skins and tying and giving to his charioteer as she saw Laig appear into the firelight and offer Finnibhear a small container, a package. Herbs and ointments came out from the package as Ferdia unwrapped it, smiling, and sending his charioteer off with Leg across the river. Packages sent from one side to the other. A show of friendship, a show of kindness. Ferdia looked and saw Finnibhear. She blushed and turned away. She thought for a moment what a kind man he was, how strong and perhaps well able to care for her. A moment she thought she could be happy with him. If he won and beat Cuchulainn, she would marry Ferdia. She would have a life with Ferdia. As she blinked, she saw Freya's head again by the river. She shook herself. The love she had had for him, stopping any chance for love she might have for anyone else, even if he did win. Once more, she wasn't sure if she fell asleep. Her flickering eyes, flickering and flapping like wings beating in the sky, darkening clouds gathering. Awn the Gap. Call, shriek, cry. Her eyes wide, lips parted dry, stiff and cold. She pulled her robes around her once more, found the furs, the warm things, the darkness all around her. She was awake again, before anyone seemed to stir in the camp. So she walked around and went to her favourite place to watch the fighting for the day. She had a good vantage point. It was nice to see the sky illuminated, different streaks of cloud shapes, the dark turning to navy and then amber as the sun rose. Cuchulainn sat hunkered down below once more, and she watched as Ferdia came to the shores of the river, seeming more stern today. And he had in his hand a heavy weapon, an ugly one. The thrusting spears, the heavy battle javelins, the ones that were used in close quarters, at the dikes and the barriers, at walls, for close, ugly fighting. The armies behind her were marching. Many were watching. She could not see Queen Medbh. She felt exhausted by the fighting, and cold and numb. A serving girl appeared next to her and gave her some food, held out in her hand meat and a drink of some warm broth. It filled her mouth with sustenance, somehow bringing sensation back to her lips. The food she swallowed in an empty stomach felt strange. She couldn't eat the flesh, while seeing the flesh falling from Cuchulainn and Ferdia below. She placed the food away, feeling sick and nauseous, looking down at those two furious fighting men, surrounded in ugly hacking and cutting. But finally they dropped their weapons. The sun, now losing light behind the darkening clouds on the western horizon, it was time to end. They dropped their weapons. They barely made it off the water without falling to their knees. They went to their fires, and both their charioteers held out food, drink, cloth, ointment. They were being cleaned down, each of them given herbs and healing, something to hold the pain in She looked away and walked away. Neither one of them could survive another day of this, she thought. She saw Queen Medbh, the rest of the army now having to stop and make camp not very far away from where they had, but at least they had a day's march. 2 days. She wondered once more what her nights would be like lying beside Finnibhear as she lay herself down to try and get some sleep in the dark. She woke in the dark. Had she slept, she did not know. She felt perhaps maybe she did. Her weariness had finally caught some rest. She gathered herself together and walked to her usual same spot around the army, the blinking lights of the fires. But she was not alone. Already she saw someone in the ford. It was Finnibhear. Finnibhear MacDamon had risen before the sun. He was standing in the ford with his sword out. And from the other side she saw Cuchulainn standing, not playing fiddle but watching. Finnibhear began to leap then twist and turn, gather rocks and throw them in the air, catch them, display feats. These were his feats that he was showing. Miraculous how he leapt and darted, ducked and dodged, and showed how agile he was, leaping and throwing stones on high, swinging and turning his sword to slash and cut. Such agility she had never seen before. A great salmon leap with a vault and a twist and a turn, a cut. Such hard, soft and swift movement, all aligned in such ease and grace she had never seen before. These feats were Finnibhear MacDamon. Had he learned them on the shadowy island of Skog? Had he learned them when he came back, perfected them over years of training, or was it just today that he was doing them for the first time, allowing himself to play? Was this how he played his game of war? Now Cuchulainn took out his sword and walked down. Not blinking nearly, Finnibhear pulled the robes around her, feeling the fur lightly touch her skin. She hunkered down. She saw the crows do the same, leaning in expectantly. As Cuchulainn waded through the water, he brought his sword high and ran at Finnibhear. Finnibhear, in the blink of an eye, had his sword parried, lashing and clashing together, the sound of their swords now waking up the sunlight that seemed to streak across the horizon. The sun burned off the clouds and seemed to burn away the water that seemed to run away from the fighting. They were now on dried rocks. The water seemed to flow on either side of them, not coming down between the fighting men because it was too fast, too furious. There was sparks coming off of their swords. She could not see the blurriness in between, which hand was moving or leg turning, twisting and fighting. Such a flurry of fighting she had never seen before, and so she was barely able to breathe, even just in between every strike and clash. She felt her heart beating. She saw the birds fly to the sky, the beating of their wings like the beating of the swords, the beating of her heart, and the fury of the fight. The lashing and the clashing now sending the water rushing away, but blood streaked down. They were cut, they were wounded, they were hurting, and the river itself began to run fully red. And then she heard a shriek and a cry from the sky. The hills itself seemed to open wide, a flurry, a movement, ghostly apparitions and figures, Bannochs and Bannochs shrieking and calling, such fury from the land itself. The sky seemed to open wide. Finnibhear felt everything, her feet in the ground, her fingertips. She'd never felt more awake, more alive, more furious. The fighting below seemed to stir that anger inside her, and she screamed, her voice echoing in and around the cawing shrieks of the birds. The murder of crows that flew through the fighting as the furious, angry sparks leapt up to seem to catch the wings that flew right on past. Cuchulainn and Finnibhear fighting so close. Finnibhear's heart seemed to burst with anger. Who was she to be married off to whoever won this fight? She didn't have the right to create her own destiny, always pawned off for whatever her mother wanted her fair eyebrows to do, her beautiful, pretty smile. Whatever her mother, Queen Medbh, asked her, she'd do it, and now she wanted to get out of it. Whatever it was, whatever way these men could fight, she could fight too. She would leave this world, she would go to Aunagat, she would rip right through the veil if she had to. She wouldn't be a pawn for her mother to wield, dangling above men's noses. She would fly to the sky like a crow and shriek death in the face. She would face it, and she would find a way to put Medbh out. She knew this now. Anger seemed to abate. She saw Cuchulainn take a blow to his chest. Was he laid low? Was he killed? Had Finnibhear won? Would she be with Finnibhear from this on out? She saw Freya's face, dead, cold, staring. She saw Cuchulainn call, a shriek, a cry. Something went into the water, a spear flowing down, Cuchulainn falling, catching, twisting, turning with his foot. He flew the spear, the sound like 1,000 angry swarming bees rang around. The shrieks and calls of Bannochs and Bannocks, of creatures and gowls of crows seemed to go as suddenly she saw the spear puncture, pierce, hit Finnibhear through his chest, through his armour, through his unbreakable skin, and shatter and twist the body. Every point and blade she saw emanating and sticking out from his ribs, skin. He was barely human. He fell. The spear. She had heard rumours of Cuchulainn's magic spear, the Cape Bolga. No one could stand against it, not even Finnibhear MacDamon, who had fallen. She saw Cuchulainn catch him and drag him across to the north side, the Ulster side of the river. She saw Finnibhear, unblinking, unmoving, blood flowing into the river below, and Cuchulainn dragging Finnibhear across, weeping over his friend's dead body, beginning to sing of the love he had for Finnibhear. She listened. She watched Cuchulainn weep. She felt nothing inside again. Finnibhear had fallen, yes. Finnibhear might have won, and she might have lived to love him. Maybe. But no. She closed her eyes and saw Freya again. The beating of black wings above made her look to the sky. Twilight and dark, sun dipping low, the armies marching now. Cuchulainn's song unheard, Medbh's army moving across Ulster. Unhindered now, she thought. She'll get whatever she wants now, she thought. Her mother always did, after all. But something had changed in Finnibhear. The death of Finnibhear, the lament from Cuchulainn. Singing all was play, all was sport, until Finnibhear came to the ford. Yes, she thought, it was a game. It was a game she had played for so long, but not anymore. She would not be the pawn her mother wanted her to be. She would find another way. She would find a way out. She blinked and closed her eyes. She saw Owen the Gat, Morrigan, the Crow, Frigg, his unblinking wide eyes. She opened eyes to see the army spreading. The host, she thought, moving far off, far to the east. Brown bull, she thought. Medbh will get her brown bull. I look up and see a flap of wings. All murderer crows dotted across the sky. So many of them. And they landing all around in the sparse, naked, pointed branches looking down at us, cawing. Cawing as if they're talking amongst each other. Ill omens. We're staying low, keeping quiet, creeping through this deserted landscape, empty of anyone defending it. Empty of even people living here. This cold, dead, desolate place. We just take a moment's pause to see the dipping sun go below the two dark clouds just above the horizon. We feel the stretching golden strands of warmth meet my face for the first time today. This dying light, all mixed with purple, pink and blue, speckled through the gaps in those dark clouds, all mixed together. Ahead of the darkening, all mixed together with the black and grey descending darkness. The only bit of warmth I'll feel now for a while. We keep on marching through these cold nights. We're getting close now.